The wind found every gap in the plank walls that night, and Rebecca Hollis counted the gaps by sound alone. 7. She had counted them 100 times since November, but the storm always found new ones to whistle through, and she lay beneath 2 wool blankets with Duke pressed against her side, his breath slow and warm against her hand, listening to the cabin groan. 31 degrees below zero. She had checked the thermometer nailed outside her door at dusk, watched the red line sink past the last painted mark, and known, without needing to check again, that it would fall further before dawn. The wood stove in the corner ticked as it cooled. She had banked it as tight as she dared, but tight banking meant less heat, and less heat meant this: lying still, counting gaps, waiting for morning like it was a debt someone owed her. How does a woman alone, 26 years old, widowed 11 months, survive a week when the temperature refuses to climb above zero even at noon? The town of Larkspur Hollow, 41 souls at the last count, had already written her off once that winter. They would do it again before the week was through. What she built beneath her woodshed, in secret, over 4 months of stolen afternoons, was about to become the only reason any of them were still breathing by the time the thaw came. Duke lifted his head first. The German shepherd's ears rose before Rebecca heard anything at all, and she reached out in the dark to rest her palm against his shoulder, feeling the low vibration building in his chest before it became sound. "Easy," she said. Her voice came out rough with cold. "It's only the wind." But it was not only the wind, and she knew it even as she said the words, because the wind did not usually make the walls shudder like something had struck them. 4 months earlier, in the last gold days of August, Rebecca Hollis had stood in the shade of her woodshed with a shovel in her hands and no one to tell her not to. Her husband Warren had been dead 6 weeks by then, thrown from a horse on a trail he had ridden 1,000 times before, and the men of Larkspur Hollow had come to the funeral with their hats in their hands and their sympathy already curdling into something else. Pity mostly, the kind that expected a woman to fold. "You'll not last the winter out here alone," old Reverend Tabor had told her at the graveside, not unkindly, but with the flat certainty of a man reading weather. "Best you sell the land, come live near your sister in the valley." Rebecca had said nothing. She had shaken his hand, thanked the mourners for their bread and their casseroles, and watched them ride away down the frozen ruts of the road with a strange, cold clarity settling into her chest. She did not intend to fold. She intended to dig. The woodshed sat 40 feet behind the cabin, a leaning structure Warren had built their first year on the claim, walls silvered with weather, roof patched twice. Beneath its dirt floor, the ground sloped down toward a natural shelf of rock, a fact Rebecca had learned only because Duke, still a lanky pup then, had once dug a hole there chasing a ground squirrel and exposed a seam of stone 6 inches down. She had filled the hole back in and thought nothing more of it until the funeral was behind her and the future in front of her looked like a mouth with no bottom. She started with the shovel on the 12th of August. The ground beneath the shed was soft where the squirrel had dug, softer than the packed earth around the cabin, and she worked in the mornings before the heat came up and again in the last hour before dusk. She measured as she went, the way Warren had taught her when they built the root cellar their second year married. 6 feet by 8 feet as a floor, 4.5 feet of headroom once the digging reached the rock shelf. "You're mad," she said to herself once, laughing without much humor in it, dirt to her elbows and her back screaming. Mad as a hatter digging a hole under a shed. Duke did not think it was mad. He lay at the shed's entrance most afternoons, chin on his paws, watching her haul buckets of dirt up a short ladder and dump them behind the tree line, where the disturbed earth would not be noticed from the road. He was 2 years old that summer. A dog Warren had bought off a freighter passing through with a litter he could not feed, and in the 11 months since the accident, he had become the only creature Rebecca spoke to without measuring her words first. 4 walls, she told him on the 14th day, sitting in the cool of the half-dug pit with her palms raw. 4 walls, a roof, and enough room for the 2 of us and the stove if it comes to that. Warren always said a root cellar keeps at 50 degrees no matter what the sky's doing above it. If a cellar can do it for potatoes, it can do it for people. She had read that fact in an almanac 2 winters before, tucked between planting charts and a recipe for salt pork, and it had stayed lodged in her mind the way certain sentences do, waiting for their use. 50 degrees. Even at 40 below on the surface, the earth 6 feet down held its warmth like a promise it intended to keep. By the first week of September, the pit was dug, and she began the harder work of shoring it. She used what timber she could spare from a fallen stand of lodgepole pine a half-mile back in the trees, dragging the logs down with a length of rope and Duke's harness lending what pull a dog could offer, then split them with a maul into rough planks for the walls and ceiling supports. She was careful with the planks. No carving, no ornament, nothing that would take an hour she could not spare. Function only. A ceiling that would hold the dirt above it, walls that would keep the earth from sliding in on her while she slept. The chimney gave her the most trouble of anything. A shelter with no way to vent smoke was a shelter she could not heat, and a shelter she could not heat was no better than the cabin above it. She spent 9 days alone working out the angle, running a length of stovepipe salvaged from an old smokehouse up through the packed earth roof and out through a gap in the woodshed's back wall, disguised from outside as nothing more than a knot in the weathered boards. When she finally lit a test fire in the small iron stove she had hauled down, piece by piece, and reassembled underground, and watched the smoke draw up and out clean, she sat down hard on the dirt floor and put her face in her hands, and it was the first time she had cried since the funeral. "We'll be all right," she told Duke, who had pressed his big head into her lap without being asked. "We'll be all right down here, whatever comes." The shelter was finished, more or less, by the 3rd week of October. 6 feet by 8 feet of packed earth floor, 4.5 feet of headroom that forced her to stoop but never quite touch the ceiling, plank walls braced every 3 feet with upright timber, a stove no bigger than a bread box that threw heat far past its size, 2 cots she had cut down from cabin furniture to fit, a shelf of preserved food, 3 lanterns, and enough oil to burn them through a month of dark. A trap door at the top of the short ladder, built flush with the woodshed's dirt floor, and covered always with a scatter of kindling and split logs, so that anyone glancing in from outside would see nothing but a woodshed doing exactly what a woodshed was meant to do. She told no one. Not the Hendricks family 2 miles east, not the widow Pruitt who came by twice a month with news and gossip in equal measure, not even her sister in the valley, whose letters had grown more insistent through the autumn that Rebecca abandoned the claim before winter closed the roads. She told only Duke, and Duke, being a dog, kept the secret better than any person could have. "Tell no one," she said to him once, only half joking, scratching behind his ears in the lantern light. "Not even the Hendricks boys, if they come sniffing around for eggs." The storm that would decide everything did not announce itself gently. It came down out of the mountains on the 2nd day of January, a wall of white that swallowed the tree line by noon and the cabin's own woodpile by 2 in the afternoon. Rebecca had felt it coming for a day and a half, the particular ache in her joints that Warren used to say was better than any barometer. And she had spent that day and a half hauling every scrap of food, every blanket, every candle stub down into the shelter, moving between cabin and shed and back again with Duke at her heels until her lungs burned from the cold air. By the time the first flakes fell, she was ready. By the time the wind rose to a scream 2 hours later, she and Duke were already below, the trapdoor closed above them, the little stove ticking as it warmed the small space, and the storm's fury reduced to a distant moan through 6 feet of packed, frozen earth. The temperature outside, had anyone been foolish enough to check it, fell to 31 below that first night and did not climb back above 0 for 6 straight days. The Larkspur Hollow schoolhouse thermometer, read faithfully each morning by the schoolmaster before he gave up and stopped leaving his own house, recorded a low of 38 below on the 4th day, a figure that would be spoken of in the valley for 20 years after as the coldest week anyone alive had witnessed. In town, the storm did not spare anyone its arithmetic. The Pruitt family burned through 4 cords of split wood in 5 days, trying to keep their drafty farmhouse above freezing, and still woke each morning to ice rimed on the inside of the windows. The Hendricks well froze solid on the 3rd day, forcing the family to melt snow over the stove for both drinking and cooking, a slow and thankless task that left them all thinner by the week's end. Old Reverend Tabor, alone in the small house behind the church, burned his good furniture piece by piece when the woodpile ran short, and would later admit, red-faced, that he had come within a single night of freezing where he sat. Rebecca Hollis knew none of this while it was happening. She knew only the small, warm dark of her shelter, the glow of the lantern turned low to save oil, Duke's steady breathing beside her on the narrow cot, and the rhythm of a life reduced to its essentials. She woke, she fed the stove 3 split logs at careful intervals. She ate cold biscuit and jerked venison because she did not want to waste fuel on cooking what did not need it. She read from the one book she had thought to bring down, a worn copy of Psalms that had belonged to her mother, and she slept when the lantern light made her eyes heavy. "Day 3, she said aloud on the 3rd morning, more to hear a voice than because Duke understood the counting. "The stove's holding steady. You're warmer than you'd be up top, aren't you, old boy?" Duke thumped his tail against the packed earth floor, and the sound of it, small and ordinary, felt to her like the most reassuring thing in the world. She had built the shelter to hold 50 degrees, no matter what raged above, and it held. She checked the small thermometer she had hung from a nail near the stove each morning and each evening, and through the worst of the storm, when the surface world was recording temperatures that would have killed an exposed person in 20 minutes, the shelter never dropped below 46 degrees, and with the stove lit, climbed comfortably past 60. The earth kept its promise. Warren's old lesson about root cellars, half remembered from a decade past, had saved her life, and the life of the dog who would not leave her side. It was on the 5th day, with the wind still screaming above and the snow drifted past the eaves of the cabin overhead, that Duke's ears rose and his low growl began, and Rebecca understood, lying rigid in the dark, that something had struck the shed above them. She rose from the cot fast enough that her head nearly caught the low ceiling, and pressed her palm flat against Duke's chest to keep him from bolting up the ladder ahead of her. "Wait," she whispered. "Wait now." The sound came again, softer this time, a scraping against the trapdoor rather than a strike, and beneath it, almost lost in the wind, a voice. "Hello?" It was faint, cracked with cold. "Is anyone down there? I saw the smoke." Rebecca's heart hammered. No one was meant to see the smoke. She had built the pipe to vent through a knothole precisely so no one would. But a man half frozen and desperate, stumbling blind through a whiteout, might see anything, might imagine anything. And the fact that this man had found her chimney's breath in the middle of the worst storm in memory told her one thing above all others. He was in trouble bad enough to be out in it at all. She climbed the ladder, with Duke pressed close behind her, lifted the trapdoor against a resistance of drifted snow, and found a man collapsed half inside the woodshed's open front, his coat crusted white, his face the gray color of a man whose body had stopped fighting the cold and started giving in to it. She recognized him, even half frozen. Ansel Whitfield, one of the Hendricks' hired hands, a man who had passed her on the road a handful of times with barely a nod, a man whose employer had been among the loudest voices at Warren's funeral, insisting she could not manage the claim alone. "You're cold," she said, which was foolish and obvious, and the only thing that came to her. "Lost the trail," he managed through lips that barely moved. "Horse went down in a drift a mile back. I thought I was going to die out here." "Come," she said, and did not wait for an answer, hooking her arm under his and hauling him toward the trapdoor with a strength she did not know she had until she needed it. Duke pressed against the man's other side, as though he understood the task, bearing weight, offering warmth, and between the two of them, woman and dog, they got Ansel Whitfield down the ladder and into the small, warm dark before the wind above had finished screaming the sentence it started. He wept when the warmth reached him, not from pain, but from the shock of not being dead, and Rebecca said nothing, only worked the frozen boots from his feet and checked his toes for the white, waxy look that meant frostbite, and found them cold but whole, saved by the shortness of his exposure and the speed of the shelter's find. "How?" he said, when he could speak again, staring around at the plank walls, the small stove throwing its steady heat, the shelf of preserved food, the two cots. "How is this warm? How is any of this warm in this?" "The ground holds heat," Rebecca said simply, wrapping a blanket tighter around his shoulders. "Same as a root cellar keeps potatoes from freezing. 6 feet down, the cold up top doesn't reach. My husband taught me that before he died. I only ever tested it on turnips before this week." Ansel laughed, a weak, startled sound, and then stopped himself as though laughing felt like a betrayal of how close he had come to not laughing again at all. "The Hendricks place is going to lose half its stock," he said quietly. "We're burning wood faster than we can split it. I only went out because Mr. Hendricks sent me for the doctor in town. His youngest boy's got a fever won't break, and I never got past the second mile." Rebecca's stomach turned cold at that, colder than the storm outside had managed. A fever, and no doctor reachable, and the temperature still falling. "How bad?" she asked. "Bad enough Mrs. Hendricks was crying when I left," Ansel said. "Bad enough Mr. Hendricks didn't argue when I said I'd try for town, and he never sends me for anything without arguing the toss first." She thought of the Hendricks family then, 2 miles east through drifts that would by now be shoulder-deep in places, a household burning through its woodpile, trying to keep one small room warm enough for a sick child. And she thought of the 50 degrees holding steady 6 feet beneath her own woodshed, and she made a decision the way she had made the decision to dig 4 months before, quickly and without asking anyone's permission. "Can you walk, once you've warmed through?" she asked Ansel. "I can walk," he said, though his voice suggested it would cost him. "Then when the wind drops, even a little, you're going to guide me to the Hendricks place, because I have a shelter that will keep that family alive better than any woodpile will, and I am not going to sit down here warm while a child burns with fever 2 miles off." Ansel stared at her. "In this storm?" "The storm isn't dropping tonight," Rebecca said. "But it drops in stages, same as it builds. There'll be a lull before dawn. There always is. We go then." Duke, as though he understood the shape of the plan, even if not its words, rose from where he had been lying against Ansel's legs and paced once to the ladder and back, and Rebecca took it, half seriously, as agreement. The lull came as she had predicted, a strange, breathless hour before the gray dawn, when the wind dropped from a scream to a low moan, and the snow fell straight instead of sideways. Rebecca dressed in every layer she owned, packed a sled she and Warren had built years before, with blankets, a portable brazier, dried food, and the last of her lamp oil, and set out into a world scoured white and silent, with Ansel limping beside her, and Duke breaking trail ahead where the drifts ran too deep for a man on foot. The 2 miles took nearly 3 hours. Twice Rebecca thought they had lost the trail entirely, and twice it was Duke's nose that found it again, casting side to side through snow up past his chest until he struck the scent of wood smoke and turned true. By the time the Hendricks farmhouse rose gray and half-buried out of the whiteout ahead of them, Rebecca's hands had gone past pain into a numbness that frightened her more than the pain had, and she understood with a clarity that felt almost peaceful how easily a person could simply stop out here and never start again. Mrs. Hendricks opened the door on a wave of smoke and desperate warmth, her face collapsing with relief at the sight of Ansel upright and alive, and then confusion at the sight of Rebecca Hollis standing beside him with a loaded sled and a snow-crusted dog. "Mrs. Hollis," she said, and there was no warmth in the name, only surprise, because the Hendricks household had been among those who told Reverend Tabor at the funeral that Rebecca would not last the season. "What are you doing out in this?" "I hear you've a sick child and a dwindling woodpile," Rebecca said, too tired and too cold for anything but plainness. "I have a place 2 miles from here that stays 50 degrees, no matter what the sky does. I'm not asking, I'm telling you to pack what you can carry and come with me, all of you, tonight, before this storm turns again." Mr. Hendricks appeared behind his wife's shoulder, a heavy-set man whose face at the funeral had worn open skepticism at the sight of a widow declaring she would keep her claim alone. He looked at Rebecca now, snow to her eyebrows, hands raw with cold, having walked 2 miles through a blizzard to offer his family shelter, and something in his expression shifted, slow and reluctant, like ice breaking on a river in spring. "You built something," he said. It was not quite a question. "I dug a hole under my woodshed, and I lined it with wood, and I put a stove in it," Rebecca said. "Call it what you like. It kept me and this dog alive through 6 days of 30 below, and it kept your own man alive last night, when he'd have died in the open otherwise. I'll not stand here arguing while your boy's fever climbs. Pack him warm, and let's go." They went. It took the better part of another 2 hours to bundle the sick child, Nathan, wrapped so thick in blankets, only his flushed face showed, along with Mrs. Hendricks and the 2 other children of the family too young to be left, while Mr. Hendricks and Ansel followed behind, hauling what supplies the sled could not carry on a second makeshift sledge built from a door dragged off its hinges. Duke ranged ahead the entire way, tireless in a manner that struck Rebecca, even exhausted as she was, as something closer to devotion than instinct. They reached the shelter as the light began to fail again, and the wind picked back up its scream. And Rebecca lit the stove high for the first time since building it, unconcerned now with rationing fuel, because 6 more bodies in a 6-by-8-foot room raised the temperature faster than any amount of split wood could alone. Nathan's fever, in the warmth and stillness, broke by midnight, and Mrs. Hendricks wept over her son's cooling forehead, the way Rebecca had wept alone in the dirt the day she first tested the chimney draw. "I said cruel things about you," Mr. Hendricks admitted later, sitting on the packed earth floor with his back against the plank wall, watching his son sleep. "At the funeral. Told the Reverend you'd not last the winter. Told my wife the same more than once. You said what most everyone thought," Rebecca said. She was too tired for anger, and besides, the man's family lay sleeping warm around her, which felt like answer enough to whatever he had said in August. "I built this so I wouldn't need anyone's good opinion to survive. Turns out it did more than that. Thank you," he said, quiet. And it cost him something to say it, she could tell. The way it costs a proud man something to hand over ground he never expected to lose. Word of the shelter spread once the storm broke and the roads opened enough for travel. Not because Rebecca told anyone, but because the Hendricks family, once safely home again with their woodpile intact and their boy recovered, could not stop talking about it. The widow Pruitt came by within the week, ostensibly to trade gossip as always, but really, Rebecca understood, to see the thing with her own eyes. "You dug it yourself," the widow said, standing in the cramped warmth of the underground room with an expression somewhere between awe and disbelief. "All summer and never said a word." "I didn't want anyone telling me it was a fool's project before I finished it," Rebecca said. "It's easier to argue with a finished shelter than with a hole half dug." "The Reverend's asking after it," Pruitt said. "Wants to know if you'd help the town dig one under the church come spring. Says if the temperature does that again next winter, and it might, he'd rather Larkspur Hollow had somewhere better than a burned pile of furniture to get through it." Rebecca considered this, standing in the small stove warmth of the space she had built with her own raw hands through the last good weather of a hard year. Duke leaning his solid weight against her leg the way he had every day since August.
through the digging and the shoring and the long, silent afternoons and the 6 days of 30 below and the desperate 3-hour walk through drifted snow to save a stranger's child. "Tell him yes," she said. "Tell him I'll teach whoever wants to learn. It isn't complicated."
6 feet down, the earth doesn't care what the sky is doing. The shelter beneath the woodshed stood for 11 more years after that winter, long after Rebecca Hollis had married again, a quiet rancher from 2 valleys over, who asked no questions about the strange dirt-floored room beneath her old woodshed, and only ever said it was the smartest thing he'd seen built on any claim in the territory. Long after the Hendricks boy had grown to a man himself and told his own children about the winter a widow woman and her German shepherd had walked 2 miles through a blizzard to save his life. Long after Larkspur Hollow had dug its own communal shelter beneath the church, at Rebecca's teaching, a larger version of the same simple principle. 6 feet of earth between the living and the worst the sky could offer. Travelers passing through the valley decades later told the story by old-timers who remembered it firsthand, or had it passed down from parents who did, would sometimes ask to see the spot, and would find, if they looked carefully, behind where the old woodshed had long since collapsed and been cleared away, a slight depression in the earth, grassed over now, marking where a young widow, with nothing but a shovel and a dog for company, had decided that the cold did not get to write the ending to her story. She had been 26 years old, alone, and written off by nearly everyone who claimed to know her chances. She had answered the only way she knew how, with her own 2 hands and 4 months of stolen daylight. And when the coldest week anyone in that territory had ever recorded came down out of the mountains, determined to prove the town right about her, she had proven, instead, that the ground beneath a woodshed could hold more warmth, more mercy, and more quiet strength than anyone standing above it had ever thought to imagine. If a story like this moved you, the kind of grit that digs in when the world says give up, take a moment to like this video and subscribe for more true frontier stories of survival, resilience, and the everyday people who refused to let the hardest winters have the final word. Share it with someone who needs a reminder that strength often starts in silence, one shovelful at a time, and leave a comment below telling us what you would have done faced with a winter like Rebecca's. We read every one, and we will be back soon with another story worth remembering.